Hello, I'm David Starkey, and this is David Starkey Talks. And today I'm going to be talking about Parliament. Back in the days of Victorian Britain and pride in Britain, there used to be the saying, England, because they really didn't talk about Britain very much, England, the mother of parliaments. It was one of those things, wasn't it? England, the workshop of the world, or in this case it was British, Britain, British, the British Empire on which the sun never sets. Well, I'm afraid the sun has set, and England, Britain, even with Scotland, is no longer the workshop of the world. But we still sort of think of that Parliament in Westminster as the mother of parliaments. Because not only is Parliament still with us, sort of, Parliament has always been there, or has been there for a very, very long time, something like 800 years in fact. I go a bit further. Some of you may have watched back in the days when I was allowed to do mainstream television, you may have watched my monarchy series. Why did I pick on monarchy? It wasn't because particularly I'm a snob or conservative or still less royalist. It was because if you want to understand England, and we really are talking about England, there is pretty much one institution, one thing that's run right through English history, and it is the monarchy. Somebody is going to be clever and say, but what about the Venerable Bede? Doesn't the Venerable Bede actually talk about the English Church when, well, there were monarchs, but there were at least 7 of them? In other words, isn't the English Church, which is still sort of with us, if you count, I suppose, Archbishop Welby as being recognisably Anglican, the English Church still being with us. So, yes, monarchy, the Church, yes, and then I would add Parliament. All 3 of them have this pretty long, more or less continuous existence throughout the span of English history. And if we get the sequence right, it's the Church, the idea of the English Church first, and really establishing an idea of English nationhood through that, even before it's expressed by the monarchy and by a single kingdom of England. Then we get the idea of the monarch of England. So we've got about AD 600, AD 800, 900. And then Parliament, well, we've got the slight interruption of the Norman conquest, but the English Church and the monarchy do survive, although they're completely reinvented. And another 200 years after that, from about 1200 onwards, we have something that is a kind of proto-parliament. So let's just have those 3 things in our heads: the Church, the Crown, and Parliament. If you're to understand English history, it's a bit like the Trinity. That's the Trinity of English history. Each one of those interplaying with the other, assuming different degrees of importance, different alliances, different tensions as the centuries roll by. So I will be, inevitably, talking about not just Parliament, but the Crown and the Church. But my focus now, unlike the monarchy series, is going to be different. It's going to be on Parliament. What I'm going to do, I'm going to begin right at the beginning, when Parliament, like a bright child, is still an embryo, a glimmer in the eye. So, what Parliament is for? Well, primarily, it's to be useful to kings. Now, that's generally true, but it doesn't quite start there. It starts, well, more or less where everybody thinks it starts. It starts with Magna Carta, and nobody can accuse Magna Carta of trying to be useful to King John. This is slightly the trap, of course, that the ultimate origin of Parliament is the classic act of opposition to a king. So am I wrong? No, it is that Magna Carta of 1215 is wonderful, big, dramatic event, beloved by Victorians, beloved, it has to be said, by the Supreme Court and everybody else. But you know what? 1215 isn't the beginning of a great straight highway, as we tend to think, driven through English history, the progressive road, the swelling road of freedom. It's not. It's a false start. And it's with that false start, with the Magna Carta of 1215, we start. But we then realise, do you know what? That there wasn't just one Magna Carta. There were several Magna Cartas. And Magna Carta isn't an event, something that happens in 1215. In the same way that there are several Magna Cartas, Magna Carta isn't an event, it's a process. It lasts a minimum of 10 years, a decade, and arguably for nearly a century. Now, what we'll do, we'll begin in 1215 and we'll show how it's a kind of false start. A false start with a bad king, and dependent on the appearance, for it to become really the beginning of that highway, of an extraordinary man, somebody who's not a king, but plays at least as big a part in English history as any king, William the Marshal, the regent for King John's little son, Henry III. So, Parliament sort of always there. But there's another big question before we get going. What's it for? Well, we sort of know what the church is for. That's to pray for us, intercede for us, look after our souls. And we kind of know what the king is for. He is the symbol of the nation, and indeed for much of English history, he is, well, sort of the government in a single person. But what's Parliament for? This seems to me to be the thing that's been got most wrong, including by those very distinguished judges of the Supreme Court. They seem to say that Parliament is there to hold the government to account. In other words, Parliament is there to be, let's be blunt, a nuisance, an opposition, to get in the way of what government wants to do. Well, that's one way you can look at Parliament. And in fact, it's what the parliaments of most European countries, most other European countries were. And you know what happened to them? They disappeared. The English Parliament itself nearly disappeared in the early 17th century. Why? Because it just became a nuisance. The big question of the history of the English Parliament isn't, as we always used to think, that the mother of parliaments was important because it was the first. It wasn't actually. France had an Estates General that was much more developed than the English Parliament earlier. The peculiar thing about the English Parliament is not that it's first, but that it survives, that it lasts, that it's continuous. And that brings us back to that first question. Why? What's it for? It's not there, you know, to be a nuisance or an opposition, though sometimes it is, and sometimes it's necessary that it is. The English Parliament is there, above all, because it's useful. It's used. By whom? By strong kings, because Parliament isn't, as we tend to think, grows when kings are weak. Parliament grows, develops, owes its origin to strong kings. Strong kings and strong parliaments go together.